Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast, where we talk about everything related to language learning. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, we have a very special guest, Bill from Squidgies. Join us as we talk all about being an Army linguist, using AI models for language learning, and much more. All right, and Bill, it is great to have you on. Thank you for coming on this week's podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here.
So, Bill, do you want to introduce yourself? You are active on in the Refold Discord servers occasionally. I think as what is it? Is it Williams Jr.? William
William
Jr.
William Jr. Yeah, which
William
are actually
Jr.
initials for my two other names. But
Okay,
yeah,
I've always read it as Junior.
that's fair. Most people probably read it that way. Yeah, I kind of lurk in the Refold Discord. I think I hang out mostly in tech and tools and in like the NLP channel. But
Mhm.
yeah, hello, my name is Bill. I'm I guess a language learning nerd and a builder of language learning software. For the past couple years, I've been working on an app that basically transforms Twitter into a tool for aspiring polyglots and language learners. And I recently decided to close that chapter and start on a new language learning app adventure called, somewhat oddly at the moment, Squidgies. Um, yeah, so that's kind of a TLDR. I think
Yeah,
I'm
what
probably,
about what
go
about
ahead.
your history? In addition to what used to be called Legible, the
Yeah.
super awesome Twitter browser for language learners, Twitter client, uh, you also are a former military linguist, which is different from an academic linguist.
That's correct. The military has essentially hijacked the word linguist to mean something completely different from an academic linguist. Clayton, I would consider you to be a real linguist, and I am rather a fake linguist. But yeah, linguist is a job that one can do in most branches of the military. And back in 2008, I joined the US Army to be a kind of linguist. It has an even sillier and loftier title in full. It was a cryptologic linguist. I never broke any codes, and I don't know anything about cryptography. But yeah, that was 5 years of my life that I spent in the U.S. Army.
They're essentially interpreters, right?
Um, some of them,
Okay.
most of them work somewhere in the sprawling intelligence infrastructure. Um, and so I would say most people who do that are doing what's referred to as signals intelligence. That can involve interpreting communications and documents, but it doesn't necessarily involve sort of being just a translator, as you might think of it.
Okay. Interesting. And you must have, you've already talked about this before.
Mhm.
I think you've been on a live stream and you discussed briefly. You were at the DLI. How was that? The Defense Language Institute.
Yeah, so DLI is a little bit like a college nestled on a hill in Monterey, California. It's a kind of idyllic place. It's a great place to be. I remember showing up my first night straight out of basic training, terrible haircut, kind of mildly traumatized by the last 3 months of my
You had
life. And
at that point, did they still have what they used to call the birth control glasses?
yes, yes, yeah. Although those are a bit in vogue now,
They're in style now. They're
yeah,
fashionable, and
yeah. I
I
mean,
think actually,
these are a
I've
bit.
heard they've
We're both
changed
wearing,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, I've heard they've changed them, so now they finally caught up with the trend 20 years ago, and I hear that they're now wireframes, which are now out of fashion, so they're still, unfortunately, not stylish.
So I'm not sure what they're issuing people who just joined the army.
Mhm.
The ugly glasses and not being allowed to have any hair is a part of this ritual of mortification that goes on in the total institution that is basic training. But I don't know why we were talking about this. Oh, I was recounting my first night at DLI, this kind of magical place. I got to my like barracks room and I heard the honking of sea lions down along the coast. It's right on the Pacific coast in Monterey, California there. And I had never heard that sound before. Um, and Yeah, so DLI, the Defense Language Institute, is where Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps linguists are trained. So it's essentially a language school. They teach a variety of languages. They have different kind of schoolhouses that are responsible for administering these courses. I did the Modern Standard Arabic course. They also teach, Chinese, Korean, Farsi, Japanese, and even um, European languages like French and Spanish.
Right, MSA. And do you still keep up with your Arabic?
So in the past couple years, since I've been working on language learning apps, I've been doing less Arabic, but I had a pretty solid maintenance routine for years. So when you're a linguist in the Army, your job title depends somewhat on your ability to pass a test. It's called the DLPT, or the Defense Language Proficiency Test. And so every year you have to take this beast of an exam. There's a listening portion, a reading comprehension portion, and a speaking portion. And you have to hit, target marks on that test in order to stay in your job and be in good standing. And then if you go above and beyond, you get some extra pay. You get a little stipend, so you're incentivized to maintain. And then after DLI, yeah, I studied Arabic at Columbia University. That was cool. I took some classical Arabic classes. I spent a summer in Jordan doing advanced Arabic classes there. And afterwards, I've always tried to maintain a little connection with the language, either by like traveling to the region or by listening to podcasts, which is a kind of my preferred maintenance mode, I guess.
Yeah, you mentioned some language apps. So when you started focusing on building language apps, so your previous thing was formerly known as Legible, which was a great concept. Essentially, link for Twitter is the way I conceptualize it. An organic way to immerse and at the same time be able to do lookups. Twitter reimagined for language learners, as you call it. And
I think
uh,
that's right. I think one piece I would add is that Twitter is a sophisticated recommender system.
mhm,
So there is a machine learning model under the hood that's sort of predicting what every user is likely to engage with and click on, and then is ranking the tweets that you see based on that fancy model, what that fancy model
that
says
is
you're
so
going to like.
powerful. I tell you, I use YouTube Shorts and TikTok for immersion learning purposes, and it seems to know what I like. So really am impressed with recommender systems.
And I think that I also am impressed with recommender systems. And if you think about all the apps that consume our collective attention these days, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, they're all based on recommender engines, recommendation systems. I think that what's missing from them for me is comprehensibility. So they may be able to implicitly learn something about, whether a bit of content is comprehensible, like if you only ever engage with content that is comprehensible to you. But I think the vision behind Legible, and even behind some other apps and prototypes that Josh and Ethan have been working on, is to more explicitly model users like vocabulary development, their grammar skills, and to build a formal model of the user's language skills, and also feed that to the recommender system so that you can kind of always be getting, comprehensible input in the content that you're being served.
So, would you say that the recommender system is why Twitter is such a great source of immersion? Because you've actually been sort of championing Twitter for the past, I don't know, 2 years that I've known you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's arguable whether me being vociferous in the chat about Twitter is just me, strutting my own stuff and trying to get people to agree with me. I think that the recommender system on Twitter, like the native recommender system, is definitely good. Like it's probably better for users or learners who are already at an intermediate or advanced level, though, for the reasons that I stated above. It doesn't necessarily know like what you're likely to comprehend, and it might serve you fairly incomprehensible content. However, if you could kind of deliberately curate your feed to be more comprehensible, then I think tweets are an amazing resource for language learners, largely because they're short and they tend to be self-contained. Again, if you're sort of adjusting for things upstream. So you'll get like kind of a whole idea or a whole summary of a headline or an article or kind of the main points, for example, of a news article articulated in a couple sentences in a tweet. Oftentimes you'll see a picture that makes all of that text even more comprehensible. And then if you find the right accounts that are talking about things that you're interested in, but then also what we might call like slice of life accounts. These are users who are just kind of talking about everyday life, sharing photos of their dogs, of like the food that they eat, the places that they go, commenting about sort of everyday things. This is also quite comprehensible, more comprehensible perhaps than some of the more abstract content that's flowing through Twitter. And if you can find that stuff in your TL, it's just a great learning resource.
Yeah, Twitter has really given power to the people when it comes to producing a written body of language. So I know that with legible, you were kind of focusing on figs like French, Italian, German, Spanish, because that's where the market is.
I've never heard
But
that before.
figs,
Mm,
figs.
thank you.
Uh, but for some languages, they the largest written body that they have is Twitter. I'm thinking regional languages that are quite big. If you look at Zhuang in China or Cebuano in the Philippines, there's 30 million speakers of both of those languages, but no one's ever heard of them. They do not tend to have books, but they do have Twitter posts. And for some languages, it's just a great way. You mentioned Jordan. So, obviously, Levantine Arabic is not usually written, but I imagine people probably tweet in dialect.
100%. So, we started with figs, but the long-term vision was exactly that. Like any under-resourced or minority language that has a community of Twitter users, you can find it and you can make
Mm.
lists of those accounts, right? And you can recommend that content to people who are learning that language. And not just learning the language, but who like may even want to engage and interact with those folks. It's an incredible resource. I hope one day, I don't know, maybe Elon Musk sells to someone else and the ecosystem can begin to grow again like it was before the acquisition.
Yeah. And on that note, YouTube is also very powerful. Um, so there's a sister language to Filipino, which is a language that I speak somewhat okay. And it's called Casagaranin. And as of 1975, there were 10,000 speakers. Not a big language at all, very small language. But I have found YouTube channels in it, and I'm sure there are Twitter posts in it. And I find that these sort of, I don't want to call them social media, but I guess they're like social platforms, right? Like YouTube, Twitter, do really bring power to these lesser resourced languages.
I'm curious why you hesitate to call them social media. They are quite clearly media and they are
They
social
are
in nature.
media and they are social, but I feel like social media, the term that people feel like is something more like Facebook or MySpace. Um, even if they are media and they are social, but I don't think that a lot of people slot them. They don't bucket them as being social media. Um,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that those folks are likely on Facebook as well, right? Those communities of people, like there
they
are
are.
likely communities speaking those languages on Facebook.
Yeah,
I'm
I read of
curious.
a language, an oceanic language with a very small amount of speakers. Something like 98% of the population of this language is in one Facebook group. Not just on Facebook as a whole, they're in
Insane,
one group. It's like the
insane.
whole written corpus of the language is in one Facebook group.
So, it's the point that you're making here is that like YouTube is this kind of cultural resource, right? It's a sort of oral historical resource, a linguistic resource that deserves sort of, I guess, being articulated and being documented and also being sort of treated as such, right? Like we don't think of YouTube in this way. We might think of it in a much sort of more trivial way, a place to go like waste time. But in fact, it is this insane cultural artifact that's global in scope,
Mm.
and there's a long tail of really interesting things happening on the platform that deserve being highlighted.
And YouTube at this point is 20 years old, maybe? So that's just, the amount of if you assume that most people with internet access use YouTube, that's just a lot of content, I always, this is one thing that used to cause friction with me and other people in the Refold community is they'd be like, "Why would you learn a language with no speakers?" And they were like, "How can you immerse? There's no anime." And I'm like, "Well, you've got YouTube and Twitter, you got Facebook groups. There definitely are communities of speakers out there if you are dedicated to learning. And now, why would you learn one of those languages? That's a different question. But if you do choose to take on that challenge, these platforms have really given back a lot, I think.
I agree, and I think that one of the barriers to entry is that it can just be challenging to find those communities.
Mhm.
And it sounds, Clayton, like you're quite good at that. I'm curious. So when you talk about some of these tiny communities that you found on Twitter or YouTube or elsewhere, like, do you have a kind of strategy? Do you have a playbook for how to
Yeah,
do that?
it's yeah, searching terms in the language. Uh,
Any
so
terms in
if you,
particular that are especially useful?
I don't have any off the top of my head, but sometimes the name of the language in the language will get you content in it. So if you type in Casaguranin on YouTube, then you'll get channels that mention it specifically. And it's bizarre because it's mutually intelligible with Tagalog, and not many. The Philippine languages are quite divergent from each other. That's not usually the case with Tagalog being having. And it's really strange. So I have a little minor obsession with it. Um, but one strategy I've also found is going to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia also tends to be in minority languages. So you can often search a term if you don't have a good dictionary. You can search a term in English, and then if you say, "Okay, I want to read it in German Low German," then they have a German Low German Wikipedia, and you can read it, get the terms there and kind of do sort of like reminds me of doing keyword research for the blog, but instead
Mhm.
of for marketing purposes and SEO, it's for language acquisition.
I mean, it sounds simple, but I think that the devil's in the details, and it sounds like an iterative process, right? Like
Mhm,
what terms you would choose to search will depend on the results of the search that you got, if you're satisfied with them, if not,
mhm,
and then you probably, rely on the recommender system or, there
mhm.
it's I think it's less obvious than it sounds. It sounds like maybe you should write some blog posts or
I
help
could.
people kind of do what you're doing there. Sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, I should. Before I took my winter vacation, I was writing a blog post a week and that fell off, but I posted my first blog post in a long time this week, and I definitely want to get back on that. And yeah, I think it could be how to find content in your language essentially, like how to use search terms and related searches and how to iterate. I think that would be a good podcast, or sorry, a good
I
blog,
agree,
but it'd
and
be a good
then, like,
podcast too.
and then after you find those communities, you find that content, sort of there's the next step of documenting it and being able to share it and surface it to someone who might be interested. And I do wonder if, there are all kinds of academic institutions that are trying to preserve languages that are kind of dedicated, to documenting languages before they go extinct, unfortunately. And I'm curious, have you ever engaged with any of those sorts of institutional efforts?
I had a linguist, Don Killian, an academic linguist, on the podcast just a few weeks ago. And I've definitely helped him with some research into Philippine languages. But beyond that, I've not. He's my only real connection to the academic world.
Yeah, might be worth looking into eventually. Could be
Yeah,
useful.
yeah, I think it could be. But I do think a lot of the academic linguists are actually keyed into this. So if you do Google Scholar
Mm,
searches, you can see that they are actually using Twitter as a corpus. So, like, I saw an
that's awesome.
interesting study relating to like code switching in Cebuano. So, for those of you who don't know, Cebuano is the second most spoken language in the Philippines. It's got about 30 million native speakers. And what they have found is that the closer you are to the Cebuano homeland, the less code switching with Tagalog or English there is. And as you get further away, you get more English code switching. And it kind of speaks to the speaker's identity. The people in the homeland are very proud, very puristic with the language. So they were able to use Twitter as a corpus, and they were able to look at the locations of the tweets and compare how much English or Tagalog was in the Cebuano. And what they found was that the further out you get, the less pure the Cebuano gets. And they didn't cast judgments, it was just an academic study. But I definitely have seen some cool studies come out of using Twitter as a corpus. So I think they're actually already keyed into it.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I meant more from the perspective of, thinking about preservation, thinking about, I don't know, institutional funding for building resources that, um, help match interested folks to content that's out there in the world. But yeah, again, it's unclear. I think the state of the academic API, the Twitter API, is a little bit
Mm,
um,
fuzzy.
in limbo uh, today, unfortunately.
Mhm.
But hopefully Elon will, figure things out and um, keep giving researchers access to do cool studies like that.
Yeah, and that sort of fuzziness also is sort of what killed, unfortunately, legible.
Yeah, so there was a small collection of third-party Twitter clients. So a third-party client is like a mobile app that
Mm.
lets you browse Twitter and do most of the things you can do on the official Twitter app, but it's maintained by third-party developers. And Twitter's policies allowed these apps. They had a somewhat stormy history. They weren't always like encouraged. But for the past few years, there were a few Twitter clients that had thousands of users, Tweetbot, Twitterific. And then one day, like a month ago, those apps' access to the API was suddenly cut off with no communications from the Twitter team. And then a week or so later, the developer policy was updated with terms that essentially banned third-party clients, and those apps kind of formally announced that they would be shutting down. And so, Legible, in its conception, was a third-party client designed specifically for language learning, and it doesn't look like Legible will be able to survive. So we've essentially stopped developing it. It's We put out an email that said we're gonna like stop it, but technically it's still running. So uh, if you're a user, you could go still use it, but we're probably going to have to wind it down completely over the coming weeks.
And your new project is Squidgies. Now, Squidgies is something I do not know a whole bunch about. Unlike Legible, which I have known about for years and I'm more keyed into. Squidgies is sort of a, a gamified learning system. There's like animals and you practice. Tell us about Squidgies? Because actually I really don't know. I'm blind here.
Sure. So Squidgies is a fun early language learning app that was started by my co-founder Dan. And there is a light layer of gamification in the app right now. The sort of fundamental idea is that a squidgy is a creature not unlike a Neopet or a Tamagotchi that you have to sort of care for in order to keep it alive. And you do that by
Neopets brings me back. I loved it as a kid.
did you Okay. Yeah, I think that there's a whole generation that experiences a certain kind of nostalgia around this basic UX. I personally don't. But so yeah, the idea is you keep your squidgy alive, and the way you keep your squidgy alive is by interacting with the squidgy and then performing a kind of standard set of exercises and games. So what's really cool about Squidgies is that it's based on the latest artificial intelligence. So it's based on large language models, in particular OpenAI's API. And what Squidgies allows you to do is, in a really quite real way, practice outputting. So Squidgies will prompt you with a question or a discussion topic, you can respond, and if you're making grammatical, syntactic, or lexical errors, Squidgies will suggest a more correct articulation of your thought. It will also then sort of remember what you got wrong, and later it will build more structured exercises, close, um, fill in the blank type exercises to follow up on those skills and vocab that you might have gotten wrong, in a previous conversation.
So, what really, well, I've got a few follow up questions here. The first one is more important to me, so I'm going to ask it first.
Sure.
Do you think this sort of gamification is important when it comes to language learning or acquiring a second language?
I think that it's a tough question. It's one that I have grappled with myself quite a bit. I think that the market, that is to say, most people who have used language learning apps, namely Duolingo, Memrise, uh, and the normal suspects, I think that the market is somewhat socialized by those apps. So to some extent, like most normies, if you will, expect a certain amount of gamification to help orient
I like
themselves.
gamification. I'm a big fan.
You're a fan, yeah. Well,
I'm a huge fan. Like I used to use Memrise, but they've tried to kill it over the years. Unfortunately,
really,
they recently, I say recently, in the past half year, the death blow to me was that none of my user scripts work. So I used, user scripts to sort of customize it the way that we would use add-ons with or plugins with Anki. Um, but I've always been a huge fan of Memrise. And one thing I've learned from coaching, so we've been doing this coaching for the past 10 or 11 months, is a lot of clients prefer the gamified SRS. So a big one right now is Closemaster because you can import your own words just like Anki, and then they have a corpus. They use, I think, Tatueba, and for each word that you import, you can choose between however many words are in or however many sentences have that word that are in the corpus. And a lot of clients end up the ones who I noticed struggled to maintain an Anki habit have not had that same issue of maintaining a close master habit. And I think it's the gamification and the social aspect, leaderboards. So
yeah, I think that I personally dislike that user experience. I dislike Duolingo. I found that when I used to use Duolingo years ago, I would become fixated on the number.
mm,
It was this weird mental shift would happen for me where I would somehow be less focused on the actual content, like the actual activity, the substantive thing that mattered. And instead, I would be sort of chasing numbers or worried about my gems and my XP points. And I really prefer immersion to that experience. Like I prefer just to be like trying to understand something, like a bit of real content, something real in the world. To me, that's a far better sort of motivating,
but you can have
like fundamental
gamified
motivating thing.
immersion like
I
Link. Link, one thing that Link does very well, not its parser, for sure. But one thing it does very well is the gamification of immersion. Sure, the words that you know are not limitized, so they're inflated, but you get little gold coins every time that you mark a word as known or you make a new word as a studied as a link as a studied word, and there's leaderboards, so it's fun to like be number one, or number one for the week. I've read 40,000 words this week. I've like just an insane amount of words or something. And to me, and this is sort of a normie trait that I have is I find that really fun. Um,
Yeah.
I
I
find it
think
actually more fun than immersion, probably in and of
my
itself.
my issues with that, Clayton, are that it's gamification, but it's also quantification
Mhm.
of things that like those numbers I don't think are actually as meaningful as the app would sort of, have them seem. And it's not just that the numbers are inflated, but it's like, what do the numbers actually represent?
Mhm.
Um, Link isn't checking your comprehension of any of those texts, right? It's the user is sort of left to supply all of the judgments around kind of what they know
Hmm.
and what they don't know. I think I agree that like I could imagine that being mm, allowing for a more engaging experience. I see Link primarily as a tool, and the app that we had built, in fact, the sort of first beta version of Legible, it too was merely a tool. I think that like you cross from tool into app when the app like actually has pedagogical authority or purports to have some pedagogical authority, and it purports to be able to say, no, Clayton, you're wrong, you didn't understand this, or you didn't conjugate this verb correctly or whatnot.
Hmm.
And it frames the gamification around correctness, and not some sort of like user self-reported you know
And does
outcome.
would you say that Squidgies does this?
So I think Squidgies aims to be pedagogical, and it aims to be an app, not a tool. I think that my issue with Duolingo is that it's far too brittle. So, I can communicate with you in French and make a bunch of conjugation errors, and you can still understand what I'm saying. So,
Mhm.
like, fluency and accuracy in output are not the same thing, right? They're two different sort of qualities of output. And Duolingo just never distinguishes between those things. So I think it's just a really brittle implementation of evaluation of correctness. And what we're trying to do with Squidgies is something more nuanced. And I think what I've seen so far of our abilities to do that is that we're at the early stages, but we're on the right track.
Sure. You touched on a point that essentially intelligibility does not always correlate with grammaticalness of a statement. A good example is Yoda. Everybody pretty much understands Yoda, but no one would say that Yoda is grammatical. See the man I have. Oh, okay, he's seen the man. We understand what he's saying,
Hmm.
but that's not good English. That's not, well, not to pass a judgment. That's not grammatical English by any measure of what would be considered grammatical by a native speaker. And you're right. If you output broken French, a native is probably going to understand you, assuming that you do enough right, just enough to make it intelligible.
Exactly. And where's that line? I think it's different for different people, right? Like, some native speakers of languages are relatively good at understanding, various registers of non-native, broken, if you will, language. And then some are less accustomed to that. And I think that the devil's in the details to some extent. Someone who can output usually at let's say a CFR A2 level, like I think an app should have certain expectations of that user, and their grading, if you will, should be kind of tuned to their baseline level and their goals, like what they want to actually get out of their experience. And I just like I don't see any of this kind of nuance in any of the apps that I've used today. Uh, you get this from teachers, obviously, and from tutors. And so, to some extent, teachers, coaches, tutors, I think these need to be our models for building language learning apps on top of AI. Um, we can't we can't reproduce all the sins of Duolingo. That said, back to this kind of question of gamification, I do think users have certain expectations when they come to a new language learning app. So it's not clear to me that the sort of conversational UX can be like the only mode of interaction in Squidgies. I think to some extent, users that might make users somewhat anxious, or like it requires a certain amount of energy, right, to think, to output, to construct sentences, to speak. And so there will be some mix of kind of exercises, close, multiple choice comprehension, um, and more dialogue based interactions.
And of course, there's going to be a desire for some people to feed their squiddies. You know,
Hopefully.
I think
Hopefully.
there will be.
Yeah.
And I tell you, user expectations are funny. I have a tablet for work, It never leaves my condo. Never. I do emails on it and such. It has a camera. I do not want a camera. I don't need a camera, at least a back camera. I don't need one, but I've got one because tablets of all price ranges have to have a camera because people expect them to have a camera. And I think that you touched on the point that people, to some degree, expect some level of gamification.
Yeah. In the long run, back to this sort of recommender system idea, I've always dreamed of an app that could adapt to my preferences for these things. So if it could somehow learn that I'm more likely to engage in gamified user experiences, then it could actually transform itself and serve me those things which are more likely to engage me. On the other hand, like if I want nothing to do with quantification or gamification and I'm really into reading tweets, it could also potentially learn that, right? And adapt its own very sort of UX assumptions to my preferences. I think it's a lofty goal, to think through building something like that. But I think it's possible, and as AI gets better and better at writing code and allowing us to quickly ship prototypes and this kind of thing, I have faith that within our lifetimes we'll see software applications that are that adaptable to user preferences.
Oh yeah, I think we're only touching. We've barely scratched the surface of um, recommender systems and AI tools.
Agreed.
So what makes Squidgies different from just chatting at Chat GPT or something?
Yeah, so at least in its current iteration, ChatGPT doesn't really remember anything about you. So it's not saving any state. It's not remembering that you misconjugated, this verb yesterday. It's not saving in a database, a stateful database, any information about your goals or kind of where you are. Basically, there's no kind of domain specific state that it is maintaining and remembering like between sessions. So you can kind of replicate some Squidgies like features in prompts to chat GPT yourself, right? You can set it up. You can be like,
Mhm.
you are a language tutor. You are tutoring, someone named Clayton. Clayton, is this good at Tagalog, et cetera, et cetera. You can set all that up for yourself. But the sort of amount of cognitive, load that incurs on the user, even just to have kind of one good interaction is non-trivial. And then to kind of like think through that every time, and then I don't know, save your output somewhere, and then re-inject that into the next context when you want to use it tomorrow. All of that is seems like way too much work to me. Uh, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think that realistically, a user is not going to want to prompt themselves or think of prompts and have to essentially deal with the lack of a saved state. You know, it's a fresh, it's fresh each time. I think that could be
Yeah,
relatively annoying. I will say ChatGPT is really hit or miss with Tagalog. I've not messed with it with other languages too much. Sometimes it puts out perfect, flawless Taglish, like it was a native. Other times, the grammar is just really wrong. So I don't know how I don't know how well ChatGPT handles all languages.
yeah, that doesn't surprise me. So we haven't like rigorously evaluated the quality of GPT. So we're not using ChatGPT. We're using
Mm,
the API, just the OpenAI
mm.
GPT-3, the models there. It doesn't surprise me that it's not super good at Tagalog, or it definitely doesn't know any Levantine Arabic, for example. I think its MSA is passable probably in certain domains like news. But um, I think the idea behind building on top of LLMs is that even if these models aren't good at that today, in
Mm.
6 months' time or a year's time, they'll get better and better at all of this stuff. And so it's a long-term bet, but it seems like a safe bet to be trying to figure out how to put these models in service of language acquisition. And so that's why, yeah, I agree. So right now, Squidgies supports English, Spanish, French, Figs, basically.
Mm.
No Italian yet, although I'd like to add it. But in theory, it becomes pretty easy to scale like arbitrary language pairs if the underlying model is good enough at all the languages involved.
Yeah, I remember there is an app called Pandaist, and it essentially was supposed to be graded news for Chinese. And at some point, the dev got really into these models from like OpenAI, and he played around with the idea of generating um, news articles with it, and he tested it on a couple of languages. And like what I found, like with Indonesian, is that sometimes it's incongruent with like levels of formality. Um, and again, the Tagalog is so. Sometimes it's grammatical,
Mhm.
sometimes it isn't. Um, it does like I think one time we prompted it to write a review on like Amazon as though it were an actual Filipino. It did great. Um, then I had it describe a medicine to me uh, in Filipino, and it did awful. So it's interesting how the grammar breaks down if you prompt it with something that it's not been trained on.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're thinking about it like, frankly, like a machine learning researcher a little bit. So, you're basically probing the model with tasks that come from specific domains, and you're varying the domains based on the likelihood or potential that a domain was included in the training set. Now, I don't actually know what's in the training set. I think most people don't. They're a bit, they keep that close to the chest, but
I bet
you
news
can
makes a
kind of
lot.
infer it, right? Oh, yeah, yeah, exactly. Like this is the sort of experiment you can do to sort of figure it out. Um, but I think, again, over time, the assumption is that these things will get better and better. Um, although I would say that like the likelihood that they'll get better and better is sort of driven by like market dynamics.
Mm,
So unfortunately, we'll probably still see a sort of rich gets richer thing happen where figs get better and better, and the languages in the tail of the distribution, like of number of speakers or of, I don't know, buying power in some markets, like might not get better as quickly. But again, kind of back to this conversation about preservation and whatnot, I think that there are opportunities there to construct data sets, to find data, to fine tune the model, to train other models. I mean, hopefully, models this powerful will become somewhat democratized, and
mm.
a sort of competitive market. Like they'll also become commoditized, right? So there'll be a competitive market for models as good as OpenAI's are today, and it will be possible, for example, to, even if no Tagalog model exists that's as good as you know the French one, to somehow train that or fine tune that on data sets that would make it better.
Yeah, and uh, I do feel like there's been an explosion of people trying to use these models in apps like Squidgies. I can think of a handful off the top of my head. One that I'm sure you're familiar with is Quisel.
Mhm. Have you
Um,
tried that one?
I played with it very briefly. It was interesting, but at the end of the day, unfortunately, I did not. I just don't have. I like people. I'm not the prototypical refolder who like I want to consume telenovelas or anime. I like to talk to people.
Mhm.
Um, so it did not scratch that itch for me. If I'm going to speak, broken French at somebody, I want it to be another person suffering. Essentially, I I want it to be another person. So it did not scratch that itch for me, unfortunately. But it's a neat concept, and it's got like
Mhm.
voice, um, you know, text to speech sort of thing.
What if, Clayton, what if you took your desire to talk to people, but then you said, well, what if I honed my ability to articulate cogent, coherent, intelligible things in a given language? And you considered that like the best way to do that is actually not to talk to a person for a while, but instead to practice with an app or an AI. Would
That's feasible.
okay.
I think it's feasible because a lot of what Refold has done is tried to replicate the immersion experience without relying on people.
Mhm.
Essentially, ideally, you would go and you would do an ALG type uh, immersion experience. Go live in the language, listen to the language, speak the language. But for a lot of people, that's just not feasible. And Refold has attempted to sort of duplicate that in a home environment. And you get your exposure instead of from conversations and from people around you, from media. And I think there is something to be said for not being dependent on other people. It takes two to tango. And sometimes you're just not going to have somebody who wants to have a conversation with you, especially if you are inflicting really broken French or whatever your target language is on them. They may have a very low tolerance for it. They may not want to have a discussion with you. And I think that it serves a role the same way that playing against AI in a video game serves a role of sort of getting you to where you can actually converse with people.
I agree. And I think writing is interesting to think about here, right? Because writing, even in your native language, is a practice that has certain effects. I would say largely positive effects, even if you write and you don't necessarily share your writing with other people. Just the process of trying to articulate yourself, your thoughts, feelings, etc., turns out to be somewhat productive. And we haven't integrated voice into Squidgies yet. It's largely chat. But I do think that there's something cool happening there too, where like I find the most benefit when I slow down and I actually think about what I'm doing as kind of writing. It might be a sentence or two long. My French isn't that good. But when I try to really articulate something as if I were really conversing with something, I'm articulating a thought that is real. I'm describing a taste or a preference, or I'm, making an observation. I was chatting with Squidgies this morning and talking about my one of my nerdy interests, which is classical music. And I asked it asked me what my favorite piece was, and we talked about it. I actually said, well, I don't have a favorite. The real answer is I don't have a favorite. There's way too many good ones. And then I asked it what its favorite was, and it said the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And so then I started like probing it for factual information about the Beethoven Violin Concerto, and it hallucinated a non-existing fourth movement. There is no fourth movement. There's only three movements to the Beethoven Violin Concerto. And so I think that these models are really good at producing fluent, grammatically correct, likely sequences of words. They're still not great at like getting the facts right, and they
They're not
and they
always
tend
factual.
to bullshit. Yes, exactly.
They're very confidently incorrect at times, and
Yes.
I've noticed that.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's early
yes,
days, but I do think that core kind of fluency component that they like produce like fluent speech can be harnessed for output practice like pretty well already at this
yeah,
stage.
people are incorrect all the time as well when it comes to facts.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's actually a very organic thing about it. And there are certain people who, rather than say they don't know, will invent something. Um, it's very common. A common example is you ask somebody for directions, and rather than say they don't know and be embarrassed, they make up something. It's over there. So I definitely think this is actually a very human thing
It's
about.
really interesting perspective. Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way. I think you make a good point. Um, One last thing about Squidgy. Happy to chat more about any other topic. But so output practice is kind of the focus right now. But there's no reason Squidgies can't immerse with you. So we have lots of examples of cool uh, Chrome extensions and other apps that wrap YouTube, that wrap Netflix, etc. that sort of read with you and let you do lookups on the web. Um, you know, w- we plan on building extensions like that and wiring them up to Squidgies, so that Squidgies is kind of aware of your immersion practice and can even potentially recycle some of that content or some of those words, phrases, constructs in your daily practice.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of potential behind Squidgies. Actually, uh, after this podcast, I'm going to have you invite me to the Squidgy server
Uh
because I'm curious now. You've piqued my interest.
oh,
So,
sounds good.
uh, switching topics because we only have a couple more minutes here. I am
Mhm.
curious, what languages are you working on now? So I do know that French is one of them, and then I think also Spanish.
So I've been working most seriously on French. Um, it's still really challenging. I think French is deceptively difficult. I think the gap between kind of classroom French, news media French, and colloquial, everyday, spoken on the street French is wide. And like you could get really good. Like I listen to news podcasts. I listen to sort of the French version of the Daily. It's called L'Heure du Monde. It's by Le Monde, the newspaper. I listen to that thing all the time, and I'm like, I can understand 90% of it, 95% with a repeat sometimes. But turn on reality TV or like hear real French people speaking colloquial French to each other, and it's a different story. And so I'm kind of in the stage where like I'm wondering like how am I going to close that gap? And then I've also found that like just having done immersion for the past 2 years, I'm not quite at a place with my output skills that I would like. And so, the pivot towards squidgies does also track against kind of my experience that I'm not sure input is enough for me, at least. I wish it were, or maybe I'm not doing it right. I'm not getting enough. But like explicit output practice and developing my output skills is kind of where I'm at with
I'm
French.
not a
Uh,
purist. I'm a big fan of explicit output practice.
That's good.
So
Yeah. I think that lots of refolders would benefit from engaging in explicit output practice. And I think they'd also benefit from using squidgies, which
my
they can find.
example is recognition with a sandcastle. So if you're an alien and you've never seen a castle before, and I show you a sandcastle, you're not going to know what it is. But as people, we have a vague idea of what a castle is. So when we see a sandcastle, we know it's a sandcastle. We know what a tower looks like. And but my question is, can you look at a sandcastle and then build your own? The answer is probably no. You'd probably
Hmm,
build a poor imitation of a sandcastle. It'd be very ugly compared to this, sand sculptor's perfect, flawless sandcastle. Um, and it's very easy to tear something down, to smash the sandcastle, to recognize the sandcastle, these passive activities. But actually producing a sandcastle is very hard. It's sort of like we all know what a perfect circle is, but how many of us can draw a perfect circle? Not many. So I'm firmly in the camp of I think explicit output practice is good.
it's an interesting analogy. I think that there are these sort of founding myths, these foundational fantasies that undergird some of the the methodology behind immersion, which is that like, one day you're going to wake up after immersing for many hours and just be able to speak magically
Mhm.
and people are going to understand you and you're not going to be, spending 30 seconds searching for a word. Um, and you're
The
not going to make
community
a
and the
host of
method
errors.
have baggage.
Agreed.
They
Agreed.
have baggage.
Agreed. And there's some ideological baggage there too. Um, but yeah, so French has been kind of my main TL, and then have been dabbling in Spanish, dabbling even less in German. I once dabbled somewhat seriously in Farsi. I plan eventually to get back to that. And then my partner is Chinese, and they speak Chinese and Cantonese, and both of those I've been eyeing for a while. I'm a little intimidated by them, but they're probably next in the queue.
So the State Department considers Arabic to be a Category 4 language. Um, Formerly Category 5, now Category 4 because they got rid of 5. But uh, Arabic and Cantonese and Mandarin are all in that same uh, Category 4. And if you did well enough in the DLI to do Arabic, I imagine you have the quote unquote aptitude to tackle a Category 4 language if you wanted to. The issue is that obviously in the DLI that was your full time job for a period of time,
Yeah.
whereas now you have other things to do.
That's right. And I wonder about those rankings. I mean, are you familiar with the methodology that informed that
I'm
taxonomy?
not. I would love to be though. I do use them just because they're convenient.
Yeah.
They're a but are you familiar with the methodology
I
behind how
don't
they?
think I don't think the methodology has been published, and I don't think that I don't think that there may be rigorous justifications for that classification, but it's not clear to me that the State Department or the FSI, the Foreign Services Institute or whatever, or the ILR, International Language Roundtable, blah blah blah. It's not clear that any of those institutions have
And
actually
isn't the ILR
published
basically
accounts.
just in the States? I don't feel like anyone uses the ILR ratings outside of the States. I don't know them. I prefer using the CEFR. Um,
Yeah, so the ILR, DLI uses the ILR. I think the State Department. I think the U.S. government uses the
Uses it,
ILR. Yeah, I don't know that anyone else does. I'm not
which
sure.
makes it not really international. But that's,
Right.
I guess, a story for another day. Uh,
Yeah. What about you, Clayton? I mean, you're widely known throughout the community as dabbling in practically every language that
that's
exists.
because I
I'm
have no
curious,
self
how do you
control.
actually apportion your time? Yeah, I mean, there's only so many hours in the day, right? So how
So
do you
I've
spend your
actually,
immersion?
I have not been doing much immersion
Mm.
um, since the new year. So I've just been focused on other interests and other things. But I never spend time on more than one language at a time. So I tend to have these phases where I read obsessively in Spanish, and it might be a week, it might be a couple of months. It's totally up in the air. And then when I lose interest, I switch to something else. And I've been dabbling in languages uh, for like, ooh, I guess it's been 12 or 13 years now. So I've got quite a backlog of things that I've dabbled in. So I can reliably, with a dictionary, pick up a book in Dutch, a native book, and read it if I wanted to. Um, so I have this large backlog of languages where I already have a good foundation. I'm probably 2C in a handful of languages. Uh, and that's less impressive than it sounds. I definitely have more respect for the people who do get native like in their target languages. But I've got ADHD, PI, primarily inattentive. Um, so I get bored very easily. Um, and yeah, I essentially role play as a language learner, learning one language. And I do that for a period of time and then I switch. So I don't actually usually do like French one day and Spanish the next. It's like all French obsessively for a week or two, a month, a few months. I think the longest I've gone was when I first started studying Filipino. I did 9 months very obsessively. I did a minimum of 2 hours a day. I went through, I wasn't totally an immersion learner at that point, but I was very input heavy, a lot of listening. And I think that was like the longest period straight where I just had laser focus. Um, so to answer your question, I do not portion my time like 30 minutes of French and then 30 minutes of Spanish. It's like all Spanish until I inevitably get bored and do something else.
Is that long history of all the languages you've studied and when you did it, is it documented somewhere?
I don't think so. Yeah, I used to be active on languagelearners.org and I tried to keep I tried to keep a journal and a log, but I'm not really a journaler type.
Mhm.
I inevitably let it fall to the side like my languages do.
Yeah, I just would love to see that log, even if it's just in top level terms, like just to see you bouncing around from all the languages. And then, it's probably so long that one could do a proper like data analysis on it, arrive at some insights.
It would be interesting, I think, but yeah, unfortunately, I have not logged it anywhere.
And last question for you, Clayton. Are you practicing output when you go through an obsessive phase with the language?
Sure. Um, I am a believer in early output. Uh, I think that I do not believe in fossilization. I think as long as you continue to input and get valid models from native speakers and you continue to be aware of your mistakes when you make them, that you will improve. So I do not believe in fossilization, which means I'm not afraid of what is called early output by the community.
Mhm.
And I'm a social creature. I very much enjoy getting on language exchange apps like Tandem or HelloTalk and inflicting my Spanish or my French or my Mandarin on a native speaker until they get bored of me. Um, so people think I'm an introvert. I'm not. I'm a socially anxious extrovert. I like to talk. I love it. And I could output at a person all day long while I'm in that sort of phase of being obsessed with a single target language for sure. And then with Filipino, I use it in my daily life. I go outside. Here lately, I've been playing board games, going to a nerd shop and playing board games with a couple other nerds, exploding kittens and stuff. Name of the game, not actually blowing up cats.
I,
but
I assume that was the name of the game. I've never heard of the game, but awesome.
but yeah, definitely output. I'm not afraid of it. Um, it's interesting. Bree, another Refold team member, does very little output historically, and she feels like my output's very good. I do support tickets in Spanish, so if somebody buys a deck or something and they have issues, they want a refund, I'm happy to talk to them. She's like, if you're 2C and not 3, then I'm a fraud. I'm like, no, you're not. It's just I have a lot of experience having these repetitive conversations over and
Mhm.
over in a very narrow range. If I were to suddenly start talking about things that I don't usually talk about in Spanish, it would fall apart really quickly. But I probably do 5 or 6 tickets a day in Spanish, so I've gotten quite good at discussing resolving these issues in Spanish. And I think that's why output is necessary because you get good at the things that you do. You get good at outputting in a domain if you do it repetitively.
100%. And it does turn out that like language is structured. Social situations they have forms, they have kind of scripts that are unwritten. There are frames for understanding what's going on in a social situation, and they are somewhat repetitive. And I totally agree. I think you can practice those. You can identify ones that are important to you, and you can practice them in a variety of ways, and it has real effects, on your abilities to to use a language.
Sure. Even in our native language, when people say, "Oh, what's up? How's it going?" They're not really asking you, how you're doing, right? They're just greeting you. And uh, even native speakers, we tend to have very repetitive conversations with each other, you
Mhm.
know. So I think there's something to be said for outputting early and outputting often, because again, I just don't believe that fossilization is real. I think that as long as you continue to study and continue to correct your mental model, there's something called like an interlanguage, which is the learner's model of the language. So you're
Mhm.
talking about, these chat models and stuff, but I think people do that too. So the learner's model is a little bit lopsided, like a child's drawing. And then over time, if they keep drawing and they keep looking at native speakers, they will correct that model if they care to. And some people don't care. Some people they get good enough to communicate, get their needs met, and they're fine. Uh, we do not have a lot of time left. We've actually gone
Are we
over, but
over?
I'll say
Uh-oh.
I'll say one last thing is I've looked at the CASAS testing, sort of the government testing for English. I looked into it for Refold to see what the metrics were. And what the government considers a survivable level of English is quite low by our standards at Refold. A lot of people, once they get their needs met, that's fine. They can go to the bank and they can buy a hamburger, and that's all they need. And some people just don't care to improve. That's where the fossilization myth comes from. And then there's not a lot of longitudinal studies. Like, we need to study the same person today, a year from now, 2 years from now, 10 years from now. And I think there's a dearth of those. I don't think there's enough to actually get to prove fossilization is real. There's just not enough follow-up studies. So definitely, to answer your question, I am an outputter. I enjoy it. I'm not afraid of fossilization, and I'm a people person. I like people. I like to chat.
Thanks for sharing. I think I definitely prefer the conversational format,
Mhm.
because it's fascinating, to hear your thoughts about language acquisition, and it's also refreshing to hear that, you kind of hold opinions which might, um, God forbid, cross with the official Matt vs. Japan doxa that served
Well,
as the founding
we
ideology
always
of
say
Refold.
it's guidelines, not a dogma. All right, and I'm gonna wrap it up here. Bill, thank you for coming on this week. It was a fantastic podcast, not long enough. That tells me there needs to be a part two.
Let's do
Um,
it. Yeah, let's do it. Great to be here.
a- and to the listeners, thank you for being here for this week's podcast, and I'll see you next week. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join to chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.